There has been a lot of hubbub in the Warcry community regarding a potential of an ally tax, and today we are going to talk about it. Welcome to All Games on Toast, all of you lovely people. It's me, it's Toast. How are you all doing today? Despite Warcry's niche status, nothing stops the drama llama from rearing its ugly head and instilling the community with all kinds of dread and spurring on the naysayers.
What? No.
Last month it was all about the death of Warcry, and now it's about a potential of an ally tax being implemented to help balance out the game. As always, I want to dive into this and give my opinion, but before we get into all of that, it's time for a little bit of shilling.
I am shocked. Shocked. Well, not that shocked.
Please consider leaving a like, a comment and subscribing, as that helps me fight against that dastardly YouTube algorithmic demon. And if you want to help in a more tangible way, then please consider signing up to my Patreon or my YouTube members, or using my Element Games affiliate link down below when buying some new Warcry gubbins. A huge shout out to my patrons and members who you can find on screen now. Badoosh. But with all of that out of the way, it's time to get on with the show.
And now for something completely different.
And we are back, so let's start off by defining what an ally tax is. Now, if I was Games Workshop and I was implementing an ally tax, it would be as simple as adding a 10% hike on all allies who do not have the ally rune mark. This basically hits any hero that you want to ally in, with the exception of, I think, Gobapalooza. This means it would not hit monsters, it would not hit thralls, and they would not hit Bladeborn, providing the Bladeborn are in faction. You could also get a little bit more nuanced by saying that the ally tax only applies to models you ally in who have the hero rune mark, which means that Bladeborn out of faction will be hit, but the Bladeborn non-heroes will not be hit, which I think is a pretty solid compromise. And the final little sprinkle to keep the maths clean would be to round up to the nearest 5 or the nearest 10, just so your numbers don't go all over the place and you've got to be 1 point over or 3 points under when you start making your lists. So with the hypothetical tax on the table now, what are the pros and cons? What are people saying? I'm going to start with the cons, the negatives I've heard in the community, because there's a fair few. And they aren't without merit. I just think there's more positives that outweigh those negatives. And firstly, it is just the most obvious. Things are going to get more expensive. Your lists are going to get more expensive. And this is always a tough pill to swallow, because when things get more expensive, the lists you've been working on no longer work, or you have to make some changes to make them work going forward. And that's never a good feeling. And this, by extension, puts restrictions on list building. And if you've been in the Warcry competitive scene long enough, you know that list building is the holy grail of Warcry, and people really like their list building, so any rumours of restriction does come with a fair amount of naysaying and doomsaying. And of course, adding in another layer to the list building system, even if it is an ally tax, just adds to the bloat that is Warcry list building. As good as the list building in Warcry is, there's a lot to it, and for new players, it's hard to pass. Let's remove our competitive hats and take a step back and look at this from the perspective of a new player, or a player just trying to get into competitive. There are a lot of players in Warcry who don't know what Bladeborn are, that they even exist. So adding in another hurdle to entry to the list building process is not great. And finally, in a vacuum, this disproportionately impacts low tier factions, because these factions aren't good anyway and they rely on their allies to really propel them into any kind of competitive viability. So if you start taxing allies, those low tier warbands really start to feel the strain. And frankly, all of these are valid concerns that I myself share to some degree, but I think a lot of these can be tackled and addressed, and that's what I'm going to try and do now with my positives or my counterpoints, to try and convey the positives of an ally tax and how it will help the game, and also to add my own brand of hyperbole to the hyperbole that's going around the community right now. So first things first, an ally tax actually allows for more diverse and nuanced balancing, increasing the cost of problematic allies without actually increasing their cost to take them in faction is an interesting design space to be in, and we've already seen it implemented in some more awkward ways with FAQs in the past. For example, Slakeslash and Vassalax spring to the top of my head whenever I think of that. So to expand on this a little bit further, thanks to new data provided by Wartally, we know that Vexmore and say the Clawback and the Megaboss are incredibly common allies within their Grand Alliance. Now, the Mega Boss and the Clawback are completely fine within their respective factions. They are well priced and they really don't need to be hit with points nerfs. The issue is that 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 players are taking these models within their warbands as allies, and that to me points with an issue with balance, and because they are so prominent within their own spheres, it leads to something I really hate to see in any competitive game, and all competitive games have this issue, is stagnation. When a game starts to stagnate, the game gets boring, and competitive players are the bane of variety. Competitive players love to stagnate their own games by accident because they are always chasing the most optimal thing, and it turns out when everyone takes the most optimal thing, the game gets a little bit boring, and the vast amount of list building variety in Warcry ultimately doesn't matter because you aren't looking at any of it. You are looking at only a very small part of it and taking that same thing over and over and over again. An ally tax would help alleviate that, and this leads back into list restrictions, and after a little bit of thought, I don't even think that's an issue, simply because any point changes applied at any point via an FAQ restricts list building somewhere, right? You can't really complain about the concept of an ally tax increasing the cost of things when we have FAQs regularly rebalancing the game's points with increases and decreases, and these are largely seen as positives. So touching back on the idea that Warcry list building is fantastic in theory, but in execution, at least competitively, it tends to actually just be a rehash of the same models and allies over and over again. An ally tax would actually push players to use the list building options. You'll be more incentivized to take in faction options, thralls, monsters if you aren't playing in the inferior US meta, and even Bladeborn in faction, as these things won't be hit by the ally tax in theory, which to me feels like it'll open up your list building options and it won't necessarily restrict them as harshly as people seem to think. Now, not to aggressively toot my own horn here, I would say I'm one of the bigger voices championing the use of low tier warbands in Warcry. I love low tier warbands and I love finding new and interesting ways to use them, and of course it's hard to ignore the fact that low tier warbands will be hit by this in a vacuum. I simply just don't think that an ally tax will be added into the game in that vacuum. I think low tier warbands will see points reductions to help them offset this ally tax, and also just to in general make them more playable, because there's a lot of pretty bad warbands in Warcry, and points reductions in addition to a tax I think will definitely help balance out that power dynamic, especially when the ally tax will then just be hitting that top end. Now of course that does come with the assumption that Games Workshop will actually be competent when they do this, if they ever do this, but we will just have to put our faith in John Bracken and hope for the best in that regard. And finally, the reality of the situation is that like a 10% tax, if you go by my proposed change, is like you're going to lose a blessing, right? Like a blessing, maybe two if you're a little bit crazy, and that's not a big deal. Like at worst you lose a blessing, at best you're getting pushed towards other options, and then the game is healthier. I don't see the issue. So in conclusion, when it comes to the ally tax, it genuinely feels like a lot of backlash is directed at something that to me just feels like a net positive for the competitive scene. There's some downsides, of course, especially if it's implemented poorly, but just that first part, right, adding a way to balance the game in a more nuanced fashion, it's just a big win in my eyes. And sure, does it disproportionately hit Destruction Soup? Yeah, it does. But we all know that Destruction needs a tune-up anyway, and we also know that Games Workshop are not going to dedicate the time or the resources or the money to massively change Warcry without some sort of model intervention to spur on a big change. So points changes are really the only way they can do that, and an ally tax is just that. It is just a points change. We see these all the time in FAQs, and that's all it is, with a little bit more nuance. Now, of course, all of this comes off the assumption that an ally tax is actually going to happen, if it ever happens, and this could be a complete waste of oxygen and time. So thanks for being here and being part of this potentially pointless diatribe. It's been a fun time. So I guess I will end the video there. Let me know in the comments down below what you think of a potential ally tax. Have I missed something? Have I missed the point completely? Or do you agree? Have I changed your mind? Have I eased your fears? Was this actually just a complete waste of time and I should shut up and never speak again? Let me know. But until next time, lads, ladies, and everybody in between and beyond, ta-ra.
Groovy.
Hey all, and welcome to the post-toast credits. A massive shout out to my algorithmic demon slayers, Andy Morris, blah blah blah, the Head Knight of Paint, Heinz D, Long Run Hobbies, Lord Phylax, Maps, Sable Saber, Steph, Steve Bean, the Houston Toad, Tough Tootin' Baby, and Velas. A huge thank you for supporting the channel, and I will catch you all next time. Ta-ra!